feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled TIFF review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is Tomato Meter approved, Eric Marchin. It's going to be a lot of work to put those subtitles in, so...
I know.
Surprise, motherfuckers! We're reviewing Mr. Kneff, directed by Steven Soderbergh.
You mean
what
Mr.
Is Mr.
Soderbergh?
Kneff? Yeah. It is a re-edit of the 1991 film KAFKA. That madman, Steven Soderbergh, comes to TIFF, goes, I'm premiering a brand new film for you guys. I get into the cinema, Eric.
New.
2 beers deep. We had 2 beers and I had a poutine at dinner. I get in.
Well, you had
full.
2 beers. I had a Diet Coke.
A Diet Coke. I sit down. Two women in front of me turn around and they go, so what do you think it's going to be? And then, you were joking about on Twitter, and I said, I think Eric is absolutely correct.
Well, even before the festival began, when we were talking about that, I mean, when you hear new Soderbergh movie, you obviously look at his filmography and you see like what he's working on right now. He currently has a film with Zoe Kravitz in post-production for HBO Max. Yeah, which probably still isn't finished yet. And then a couple other things that are in the works that he's been developing for a while. He's got another TV show that was just announced that he's going to be doing shortly called Full Circle or something to that extent. And so you're thinking like, okay, maybe did he shoot something on the fly between one of these productions, whether it be, No Sudden Move and Kimmy, or is there something that like maybe he's had for a while that you can go back into the archives of online interviews that he's done or with print press and like look to find the clues. Mr. Policeman, I gave you all the clues. Or maybe he re-edited somebody else's movie, or maybe it's a film that he's always been talking about re-editing and basically remaking in the version that he's always wanted to, whether it be KAFKA, which was his second film that he wasn't happy with when Miramax released it, and obviously was kind of putting it or positioning it as an Oscar player after, Jeremy Irons had won the Oscar for Reversal of Fortune and was also coming off of the success of, David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers. And you look at something like Full Frontal, which he's also talked about having another cut of, and Schizopolis, the one movie that he quote unquote stars in, which is, experimental in its own right. So, thinking about all of that, you have to kind of consider, okay, well, what's the most logical step? Okay, he's going to be doing Soderbergh is the ultimate hustler, and what he was able to do, we talked about this after watching the movie, and we'll talk a little bit about the plot or what it is now compared to what it was then. But I mentioned this to you when we were walking out of the theater, and kind of what it is almost. I never went to one of them, but if you're from Toronto, and you'll see these bulletin board posts, or you used to anyways, of this cinema forum that was run by a very problematic individual named Reg Hart, where he would play movies like Nosferatu with a Radiohead soundtrack instead of like the classical score that would be accompanying
almost remixing movies.
Yeah. I mean, people have always talked about
Racer Trash, which is what Peter Kaplowski is a huge fan of, and he brought them to Toronto to do like unofficial Midnight Madness Racer Trash remixes at the Royal this year. And if you've watched their stuff on Twitch, they kind of do a similar thing where they take a movie and they kind of distort it and put different music on it and kind of turn it into something else, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, even going back further, I mean, the old adage was like, oh, smoke a joint and watch The Wizard of Oz with Dark Side of the Moon, yeah. Right? And that's exactly what this movie almost is. Yeah. Soderbergh, instead of booking the Royal or booking sort of a rep theater, Soderbergh was able to book TIFF to essentially
Princess of Wales on the second last night
to essentially launch what will probably end up being this self-released Blu-ray box set down the line of some of these movies that he's re-edited to sell on his website, which is ingenious. I mean, the man is a king in terms
Yeah,
of just
it's
a
hilarious. Yeah.
self-profiting, like, and he's earned it too. Like, he's just
Oh
an
yeah.
interesting guy, an interesting filmmaker. And you know hearing all about that, and Matt, you specifically were talking about this right before the movie began, and a
With
couple of
these two
women.
women?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so, getting back to that, so the 2 women in front of me were like, "What do you think it's gonna be?" And talking with Eric throughout the week, you kind of were like, "I think it's the Kafka re-edit," and I was like, "Eric, I think you're right." Like, it's like, there's nothing else it could be. Like, if it was Kimmy from, I think we would have known that, like, I think that would have leaked that, so I'm like, "It has to be a re-edit," and you were just like, "If it's Kafka, I'm gonna laugh my ass off." And then so I said this to these 2 women in front of me, and they're like, "What?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I think it's a re-edit of a movie he made 30 years ago." And they're like, "That's not new." And I was like, "Yeah, I mean, sure." I'm like, "But that's what I honestly think it's going to be." And then they went on to ask me my favorite movie and my favorite Soderbergh movie and all this stuff. Um,
And you said
but right
Kafka.
yeah, right when I told them that, I could just see the disappointment in their faces. And Eric, did they get up and leave 20 minutes in? They absolutely did. So
Right.
we'll get to the movie now, though. So yeah, Soderbergh comes out and he even prefaces, like, tries to
Cameron
set,
Bailey
like,
too. Like,
yeah,
that's amazing as
he's just like,
well.
"What's your favorite Soderbergh movie? Mine's this and
And
this
sometimes
and
it's this, but
this."
now it's this. And they were trying to soften the blow of what it is ultimately going to be. And I don't
Sold
know.
out Princess of Wales, social distancing, so you got to think 50% capacity, but
Yeah.
still probably like 1,000 people
But you also have to understand that maybe there is probably a decent amount of people there that
that
are,
knew what they were getting into,
yeah,
yeah,
and
or
they,
open to it.
or yeah, they won't mind because it's Steven Soderbergh. And like, I was sitting a couple seats away from Mark Hansen from Bay Street Video, and he's a really wonderful film critic and podcaster as well, and a huge Steven Soderbergh fan. And we were talking about that exact same thing right before the movie began, or right when the introduction began, and it was just so funny, like, hearing Cameron Bailey kind of set the stage and kind of
And
trying
then right
to,
away you go, "I know what's happening right
yeah,
now."
and then Soderbergh comes out and talks about being this kind of like, you know, in this state of euphoria due to, to the COVID, but also being a film critic and a filmmaker, and having this bag of weed and doing
Yeah,
something really
he called it like,
strange.
what my idea here was what if a deranged film critic slash fan had a giant bag of weed and all of the footage that I used for the shooting of Kafka and remade it into something completely new. On top of that, also having my Spotify playlists all to their, like, access. And then he's just like prefaced it and he's like, "So let me know what you think." And then he's like, he didn't even announce that it was, Mr. Kneff, which is what the movie is ultimately titled. Um,
What
and then
would
the
have only
movie's like,
what would have made this only, like, just like perfect, like, from beginning to end, isn't even what's in the movie or how the movie was sort of presented, but it would have been amazing if Soderbergh was in the lobby selling merchandise of, this film, but all of his other stuff, like he does on his website, because it almost feels like that in a weird way. Like, it has this kind of rock concert quality to it, where you're coming to see the filmmaker even before the movie, right? Like, a lot of people are there because it is Steven Soderbergh's name on it. Like, if you were to present, and nothing against an up and coming filmmaker or somebody that has a really, like, that has a great film that they maybe want people to discover on its own merits, but that with this, the reason why people are coming to it is because of Soderbergh. It's not just because it's a film that is a mystery movie. Like, if you were to just say we have a mystery movie
surprise screening. Yeah.
surprise screening, that isn't probably going to be enough to pique the curiosity of
I think
most people, right?
I think it would, but then you're setting up even more disappointment because then people run wild with, is it Nightmare Alley? Is it this? Is it, like, if you just say secret screening and you don't set it up with who it's from or anything like that, people will think a myriad of different things,
I
in
I
my
guess I
opinion.
guess I agree with you to a certain extent, but at the same time, if you say, like, okay, like say if it was Guillermo del Toro, then you're automatically going to think it's Nightmare Alley. Like
No,
you're
but I'm
not
just saying if you said surprise screening and you didn't say who it was from or
right.
anything, like then I think people think it's something brand new.
But I
I
think
mean, even
more
in this
people would
case,
be
people thought
hesitant though, because it's not there's something about that surprise that I don't know if people would be willing to go at this point, even if it just said like it was that
sure.
vague.
You're saying
Because
like during COVID and stuff like
yeah,
that.
but
Yeah.
even in general, because again, it's like I don't want to waste like $40 on a ticket that's just a surprise. Yeah, it could be Nightmare Alley, but it also could be this small, again, no offense to any
I love
Canadian
surprise
films.
screenings. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
I
but with
love the excitement
Soderbergh's
of them,
name,
but
there's a certain amount of recognition that goes with that, right? Where like you're not just saying
here's the
like,
thing.
oh,
So
it's a
my
surprise
argument is
movie. It's a Soderbergh film, or like if it was a Guillermo del Toro movie, I'd be like, it's a Guillermo del Toro
I
movie,
get you
you
give
know?
people a nugget by saying what the filmmaker is, but my argument back to is like, I think when you just say surprise screening, when New York has a surprise screening or Sundance has a surprise screening, it's usually like a big movie, right? Like it's
Right.
usually something that's like very anticipated or 6 months down the line it's so early to see it or something like that. Where I think you set people up by saying it's a new film by Steven Soderbergh, saying it's a surprise screening that you can kind of get away with this without, too much backlash. But we should get into the movie. So essentially, you know, it starts and the titles come on, the music, you're like, this is interesting, it's in black and white, then you immediately realize it's Kafka, and then Mr. Neff comes on, and well, right when Jeremy Irons' name pops up for even someone who hasn't seen the original Kafka. So we have two unique perspectives here because I've never seen Kafka. You have seen Kafka. You said it's
Yes.
been a while.
Yep.
But it was such a fascinating experience. And I think, you put it very well at the beginning, Eric, saying it felt like this underground kind of like experimental, cool movie club thing that you went to, where I found it one of the most unique kind of TIFF premieres that I've been to because of that. And, he even prefaced before the movie being like, you might think something's wrong with the audio, but I assure you nothing will be wrong with the audio. And then, so as the movie starts, you hear music, and it's like sometimes you get that jazzy kind of oceans style music he likes using at the beginning, at least, and then
But there's also this
some synthy
psychedelic
kind of,
funk
yeah,
kind of
yeah, funky,
70s.
yeah, music to it, and you're like, this doesn't fit at all. And then people start talking quotes, and nothing comes out of their mouth, and there's just color coded subtitles based on who's speaking. So Mr. Neff, the titular Mr. Neff, formerly the artist formerly known as Kafka,
Which in
is
itself is
talking,
very Kafka-esque.
yeah, and he has white subtitles, and then everyone else is color coded depending on when they're in a scene and things like that. And the movie is completely silent, using a lot of the same footage from Kafka and some stuff we probably haven't seen before. Eric, you can get into that in a second. And yeah, it has this weird, eccentric soundtrack to it that has some modern stuff, has some, funky jazz kind of music in it, some
But it's
stuff you
all
would,
orchestral too. We should mention
yeah,
that, where like at one point you hear Metallica's Enter Sandman, but it's all done orchestrally in the same way
yeah,
that like, Jungle Cruise used
yeah.
Metallica, with working with in collaboration with James Newton Howard.
Hmm.
And it's just funny that to think that like this huge Disney movie, uses a band that at in the 80s and 90s was considered to be sort of against mainstream and rebellious, and now is being used by a major conglomerate, and then also is being used by Steven Soderbergh, which actually kind of fits perfectly because I could see him having used that in the early 90s, because Soderbergh, for a lot of people, like obviously, again, this was his sophomore film after Sex Lies and Videotape, and you know he was coming with this new group of filmmakers, the Tarantinos, the Spike Lees, the Spike Jones, like they were all coming at this time where they were defining, cinema for the 90s. And Kafka's this really weird kind of film for him. That and The Underneath, that's another movie that I'll talk about a little bit as well in a minute. Where after Sex Lies and Videotape comes out, it's this movie where you take these, big mainstream actors of the time, James Spader, Andy McDowell, Peter Gallagher, and you have them talk about very intimate and sexual sort of things and desires, and it was kind of taboo, at the time, and cutting edge. And now you look back at it and it's kind of silly and dated because it's one of those cliched movies where a character picks up a video cam recorder and records things. But then it was like cool, right?
Yeah.
And then like thinking like, oh, this indie director, and the Weinsteins were like, oh, let's get him to make a studio period piece. And it's not actually too dissimilar to the way that like Marvel or some studios work, where they come in and pick up a Sundance filmmaker who's made
Darling,
something.
yeah.
Yeah. And then they say like, oh, we'll give you the keys to go and do this, but we're still kind of controlling everything within that realm. And so that's exactly kind of what Kafka was, with the exception is that Soderbergh's sort of his sort of idea for what Kafka was going to be a black and white, um it not necessarily wasn't going to be silent, because there was talk of him doing a German dub with the
Hmm.
American actors, but doing like a dubbed over version, but it was going to be experimental. And even though um the theatrical cut of Kafka doesn't work, and again, it's been a while since I've seen that version, what you're getting isn't necessarily a stuffy period piece. You're getting almost his take on a Terry Gilliam film, especially in the third act, where things get really um sort of more surreal and out there with the camera work. But even in some of the earlier scenes, like, he was trying to do something different within the context of just your classic kind of awards baity movie, but it was taken
Biopic,
away.
yeah.
Yeah, it was taken away from him. And ultimately he has been obsessing over the film for
For
the last
30
30 years.
years.
And I think that
Yeah.
actually is interesting and worth having a conversation in itself, because it says something about Soderbergh as a person, for a guy that maybe just can't let something go.
But I think that's a lot of like, I mean, the old saying is like you're never finished with a movie. You just, put it out there, right? Like,
Right,
and
but
I
some
think
people are able to walk away and
and just
move
go move
on,
on to their
right?
next thing, where with
Where
something like this that was a failure at the time, he seems like he's really disappointed in that and has wanted to go back.
Yeah, and never got to make the movie that he wanted to. And again, this also goes to the Underneath, where for people that don't know about that movie, that was kind of his first sort of crack at a neo noir with Peter Gallagher. Some people, there are some people that really do like it, and it's not a bad movie per se. It's kind of a minor sort of thriller overall, but it is worth checking out if you're a Soderbergh completist or just kind of interested within the genre. But it's one of those films that Soderbergh himself doesn't even like to even talk about. Like, that's the kind of movie he just does not like that film, and he won't even touch it to like re-edit it or look at it. Where for the longest time, the only way to get it was through the Criterion Blu-ray DVD of King of the Hill, uh, and more recently, Kino
The
released it.
Fox animated show.
No, 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 no. Steven Soderbergh's King of the Hill, which is
I
his
know.
coming of age
I'm
film
being an
with
idiot.
Jesse Bradford and Katherine Heigl in an early performance. And so that was a part of the Criterion Blu-ray of
Interesting.
that. But then Kino Lorber released an individual edition not too long ago. But you look at that and you're kind of like, okay, well, why hasn't he been obsessing over like fixing that movie or doing something with that the way that he has with Mr. Neff, or the way that he supposedly has with Full Frontal or Schizopolis? So I think that there is something there in terms of that hubris and ego to kind of fix things. And he's also, again, a guy that has talked to other filmmakers after watching their works and said, this is how I would change things, or this is how I would edit things, to the point where like he's pissed off some people, like,
Which no one wants to hear. They're like,
Paul
"Homie, it's
Schrader
my movie."
specifically.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know but yeah, he's always been a fascinating guy, and what he's done here is created this, I think you put it best, as this sort of like this weird psychedelic experimental silent era film, but modernized with music that is funky and surreal, and then also incorporating the same meta qualities that some of Kafka's literature has, where you
Yeah.
have the main character, Mr. Neff, formerly known as Kafka, who maybe still is Kafka, working for this insurance company, but also getting caught up in this rebellion between the hierarchy, being the castle, and rebels that are sort of infiltrating on a ground level through this insurance company. And as the movie progresses, you see Kafka kind of, writing down these little sort of
Mr. Neff.
Mr. Neff or Kafka or Jeremy Irons writing his stories, and even the nitrate changing in terms of like
Hmm. They go to
going
black and white to like not a sepia, but like an orangey
yeah, it's
kind
like a
of tone.
sickly kind of like cigarette burnt kind of look to it,
Yeah,
where
it's a good way.
yeah, and again, a lot of silent era films kind of used either one of those. So, again, you're getting
Eventually going into color when you go into the castle. Yeah.
yeah, and that was true of the original version as well. It's just how you get there is changed a little bit. But watching the film, I think you again summed it up nicely. This is probably one of the best experiences I've had at TIFF, just in terms of being something really special and just
And unique.
unique.
Yeah. Yeah.
And seeing something that yeah is somewhat familiar but new, and watching a filmmaker kind of do something that's a little unorthodox. And I think that that's and
Oh,
it's a
he's a
fun
madman. It's just fun.
but
Yeah,
it's a
like
fun the movie itself is an archival exercise and experience, but it's still weirdly enjoyable, and it
oh,
moves
the
at a
music I
great
think carries
pace.
it. Yeah, the music is really carries it, and I think just the strange nature of no audio, but you have all the Foley effects and the the sound in the background. So whether it's footsteps or all of the sound effects are there, so you have this weird mix of a soundtrack, not even a score, with the sound effects, and then these color coded. With the movie being mostly in black and white and this kind of cigarette yellowy kind of tone throughout it, the color coded even subtitles are even engaging, where if because you have to read along throughout the whole thing, that you don't necessarily know exactly what character they're coming from when there's three or four people talking. You can kind of match it because it does match when people are talking on screen. But it just had this, yeah, it's just this experimental nature to it that you're like, this guy is a madman to come to TIFF and premiere this movie here when it's something he would have just released for free on his website
Right.
or something like that, where and it's just like, I don't know, it keeps your interest. I think at times I was a little confused at what was happening because I found it, a little hard to follow when when there's no dialogue and you're reading and first time seeing the movie and things like that, where there were times where I'm like, wait, what is happening? But then it was always engaging because another needle drop would happen or some sort of weird, you know, piece of music that wouldn't necessarily fit the time period or even what's happening, but it just had this energy to it the whole movie that it carried it, even being a silent film. And it's obviously not going to work for everyone because there were walkouts and like the women in front of me, and I saw a few other people in the orchestra where you were sitting, Eric, get up and leave. But I don't know, like it really just kind of was a fun experience, seeing this kind of remix of a movie in a big venue like Princess of Wales. And the movie itself, I think, it's hard to compare because I haven't seen the original, but this version of the movie I thoroughly enjoyed. For, if this was the original version, I'd be like, wow, what a interesting choice
It would be pretty
for everything.
groundbreaking if that if
Yeah.
he was allowed to make that movie back in 91. But even now you're watching it, like I feel like you're getting in the mindset of Steven Soderbergh watching this movie, where you're thinking like, okay, I'm starting to see how the mechanics of his brain work, and sort of how what he was trying to do with the original one, and obviously wasn't able to do. um it's also just nice seeing people like the late Sir Alec Guinness and Ian Holm and Brian Glover again on the big screen. And there is some stuff like even in the original one that I kind of took for granted with the camera work and some of the reveals. Like even though I'm not sure, like, I feel almost like someone like Alex Price maybe saw this, the guy who directed The Crow and then Dark City specifically, and maybe took some tips, and obviously also is a Terry Gilliam fan. But I really love sort of all the stuff that takes place in the castle when it's in color, and sort of how far that goes and the weirdness of it. And
Hmm.
even though, again, the theatrical cut doesn't really work, there's stuff in there that kind of feels like it was ahead of its time, even if that sounds cliche.
Yeah, I agree. The cinematography and whatever he had access to the negatives, I think. So like it looked gorgeous.
Yeah.
Like for a movie that's 30 years old and presented in the best way possible with that sound and the 2:3:9 widescreen properly masked at the Princess of Wales. I'm always amazed because you just see how great stuff that was shot on film holds up if you get the right transfer, right? Like if you get a good 4K transfer of a movie from 30 years ago, it looks like it was shot yesterday. And like, yeah, I did feel like, the stuff in the castle especially, I really really enjoyed, but the whole movie looked gorgeous, both the black and white, even the cigarette yellow stain stuff, and then the color stuff all looked really really nice.
Yeah, and again, like, if you're a Soderbergh fan, and he does release this on a box set, which he's been implying that he's going to at some point, it's worth picking up, and it's worth watching, and it's just a fascinating, archival experience. And to look at somebody who, again, has an obsessive sort of component to their personality that couldn't let this thing go, and had to kind of, reshape this thing in the vision that he originally saw it in. It makes it worthwhile. And you're just thinking to
Hmm.
yourself, like, okay, yeah, like, to your point, like, there are some filmmakers that, how do you know if a painting's done, or how do you know if a piece of music is done? And sometimes
It's
people
never
just,
done. You're just okay putting it out.
right.
You're
But then there
finally
are
like,
some people that are just totally, they can completely divorce themselves from the work, where they just look at it as a job. Where
sure.
Soderbergh is a guy that, even now his movies are very experimental. He was kind of one of the first guys that kind of, like, really brought to the point of, like, he's making one for them and one for him, when, he goes and makes the Ocean sequels, and then goes and does, Bubble or The Girlfriend Experience, which again don't always work. But there's something really interesting there in sort of doing these lo-fi movies in between studio films, but then also when he's doing studio movies, interjecting them with kind of a more indie sensibility that doesn't always kind of translate when, sort of indie filmmakers go to the big leagues, and sometimes their voice can get lost. Where Soderbergh, like, even, No Sudden Move, which I wasn't, like, completely sold on, but I did like moments of it, as you eat is it protein bar?
It's a Cliff Bar.
Cool. There's no Cliff Bars in Mr. Kneff, unfortunately, but you're watching, No Sudden Move, and the way that he uses kind of, these widescreen lenses, and, the way that his camera movements work. There's just something strange, and almost like it's been made by a person more so than it has been by a committee. And that's
I
something
don't
that,
know if it's the right choice of words, but almost like a playfulness in at least
no, I
his
think that is a good
like,
choice of words. It is very
um,
playful.
and even going back to this, like I feel like again it all kind of comes together where he, even for a guy who retired, what, a decade ago or
He's the
longer.
worst at
um
retiring.
yeah, he he's just, I love that he just loves tinkering with stuff. Like even some of the things, like again, this reminded me of, I remember hearing from people being like, oh, he had a version of Raiders of the Lost Ark that was he turned it into a silent film in black and white, right?
Right.
And he'll just fuck around and do stuff like that, and that stuff's fun, and we don't get enough of that, right? Like, we
Other than Topher Grace doing the Star Wars edits online.
or Zack Snyder's Justice League or something like that, right?
Right.
But you don't get a lot of filmmakers going back to something that they either didn't love or even that they did love, and they just want to kind of mess around with it and just kind of experiment and do something fun. Like, um, it just we don't get enough of that. That's why I thought this was a really, really cool experience. That like, yeah, maybe someone does something like this, and you go to TIFF Bell Lightbox on a Friday night, like during the year, and you got cinephiles there, and everyone knows what they're getting into because it's the re-edit of Kafka and things like that. But um, I like these big events that is kind of like, ooh, what's this going to be? And, or even if you knew what it was going to be, like, I think stuff like this is just kind of a wholly unique experience. And, it's not going to be for everyone, but if you're either a fan of Soderbergh or a fan of just kind of messing around with the movies or even the filmmaking process or the editing process or any part of that, like, I think it's a cool thing to watch because of that.
Yeah, and to your point, like, the idea of the director's cut, being something that, uh, in the 1980s specifically, where you had Blade Runner, which really was a director's cut, because you look at the in comparison and contrast to what the theatrical version of that movie was to the final cut and how significant a change is. But over the decades, you've seen that term kind of being put on Blu-rays and DVDs, or
Watered
being,
down.
yeah, used so loosely, just inserting deleted scenes back into the film that maybe don't even work. It's just to extend running time or to justify giving it the title of the director's cut, where, not wasn't a fan of Zack Snyder's Justice League, but at least that is a director's cut. That does feel like it is his vision on the screen, where this Mr. Neff is Soderbergh's movie, and it is truly earning of that
Oh, for
title of
better or for
director's
worse,
cut.
both of those movies are purely the director getting to do what they wanted, right?
Yeah.
Um and I hope we get kind of more weird experiments like that. Like, I think it's really fascinating for someone to go back with having all the knowledge over, how it was received originally, or Soderbergh, all the stuff he's learned over the years in those 30 years and stuff like that. And I hope I'm all for going back and fucking around. Like, I mean, sure, we poke fun at George Lucas, who continuously did that with Star Wars and things like that. And sometimes you don't always love what someone does because you love the original work or something like that. Sometimes that can be a bad thing because then they make it worse. But in your opinion, but I'm all for, because the original version is usually always going to be there if you want to watch it, right? Like the
Yeah.
original Kafka, you can still watch if you want.
Which I
The
would still
original
recommend. And he even
the
said,
original Star Wars are harder to find, but I
right,
mean,
right. Yeah,
yeah.
and I think that's the thing, where, like, that's the difference, where, Lucas basically wanted to erase the
Yeah.
original cuts of the Star Wars movies, which is also just strange, considering, the directors of 2 and 3, Ivan Kushner and Richard Marquand, they're, yes, Lucas is the creator of the world, but I mean, you think that they would have some say in terms of what's happening with the films that they made, even though, yes, they're both dead now, but um there is something there where it's like, okay, Lucas should be allowed to do whatever he wants, and yeah, you don't have to agree with what he's doing. Certainly we have, talked about this time and time again. um but the original one should be there, and nobody's saying that the original Kafka, even though nobody really is like championing that film, is going to be disposed of. It's just nice to have both. And Soderbergh, even in the introduction, said, you know, when Mr. Neff is available, maybe watch that movie first and then watch Kafka afterwards. And then sort of look at, like, this is the movie I wanted to make, and I finally got the chance to do that. Whether or not you like it, that's totally up to you, but now you can see what my intent was compared to what the studio's mandate was, and what
And I
the
think
the,
that's
the notes
fascinating, right?
were.
And that's cool to have. Even
Absolutely.
for film classes and stuff in the future too. Like, I think it'll be really interesting for film teachers to kind of have these things and show you how much an edit can change something, or how much, stuff like that can change a movie, and, whether you have full control versus what a studio tells you. Like, I think I would, program it as a double feature where you had to watch both versions and write a paper on it or something. That could be cool, right?
Yeah, another movie that's also like that I would recommend, is Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America, which is his last film with Robert De Niro and James Woods and Joe Pesci and Treat Williams, and um you look at the original cut of that movie, which is well over 3 hours long, that played at Cannes, that um, is this, again, sprawling epic. And then you watch the theatrical cut that was released in America. It's butchered. Like
Yeah.
there's stuff in that film.
I think I own the director's cut. I still haven't watched it, but
You probably have both of them in there. As
probably, yeah.
as I'm talking, I'm going to quickly grab it so I can
Yeah.
show you it. I'm usually not a prop guy, but I feel like this is necessary.
We're on video now. You can use all your props,
Yeah, I
man.
know. Hold on, I gotta
And
reach
for
over
audio
here.
listeners, Eric has a giant wall of Blu-rays behind him. If you've never watched the YouTube version or
Okay.
didn't know.
So
Okay.
yeah, so this is it. And then with this, there's so okay, I'm just looking on this now.
I would show you my version, but it's on
Yeah, so
Apple
the
TV.
extended director's cut, the theatrical cut, and with both versions of the film, I think they're both worth watching. But if you only watch the theatrical version, it's terrible because it doesn't make any sense. There are scenes where there's one scene where De Niro like enters one room and then miraculously shows up in another, and there's no reasoning
So
for
there's
it.
actual like continuity errors and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so in the extended cut, you find out that, oh, the way that he got to this other room is through this like secret childhood like compartment that he would always go through as a kid, and they show you that, and they cut all that out, and it just doesn't make any sense when you're watching it in the theatrical cut. So that's another reason to watch an extended or director's cut versus the theatrical cut, because even though maybe one version is inept compared to what the vision of that director was, if you watch the theatrical version, you're getting the full experience. But then again, you can also say that sometimes it can be a little bit pretentious or over the top, and there are plenty of movies where you look at like Wim Wenders Until the End of the World with William Hurt, and you're like, I don't know if I really want to watch a 6-hour film, about sort of a post-apocalyptic setting that's also kind of a detective story. But I mean, it's kind of worth it just to look at it from the point of view of, again, sort of where the cut is, right? And like what was deemed like, okay, this is what we have to do in order to fit this movie in a theater for 2 to 3 weeks or something like that. So and especially in the US, where I think in parts of Europe and Asia, people are more open to longer cuts, or even when people were growing up in the 1960s and 70s, there was a time where longer movies were considered fine. You look at something like Lawrence of Arabia, that movie now would never play anywhere ever.
I mean, we're getting a 2-hour and 45-minute Bond movie in like 3 weeks.
But that's still under like
yeah.
3
hours. We don't get many
right?
3.5-hour movies
No.
anymore, right? No, very rarely. Like, what's the longest thing in recent memory? Endgame at 3 hours and 1 minute.
Yeah,
like, I think they'll when it comes to mainstream cinema, like something that plays in multiplexes and things like that. I'm trying to think what else.
Like even The Irishman was cut down from what I thought it would be. Like you think that movie would be
close to 4 hours.
4 hours, right? Yeah,
and it's over 3 hours too, isn't it?
Yeah, or close to it at least.
Yeah.
So yeah, you don't get.
But this is a breezy 90 minutes.
Yes.
He cut 20 minutes out of it.
Yeah,
actually. So I think that's impressive. I think this was a really interesting convo, Eric, about we didn't like focus too much on the movie, but I mean, the movie Kafka's exist for 30 years. And the biggest things we told you, it's a silent movie now. He cut 20 minutes out of it, color coded subtitles, weird soundtrack that weirdly works with it. And I had a good time with it. So a weird one to put a rating on, but I'm going to give it a 3.5. And I really enjoyed this conversation about like director's cuts and messing with editing and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. And just, again, part of it is just the experience, because overall you're looking at something that is now archival footage for the most part. And there's more of a curiosity there than I think anything else. But I think that curiosity was rewarded with a really novel movie going experience, and one that can't be replicated. And it just was a reminder, especially now that we don't go to the theaters as much as we used to, just because of the world we're living in. But this was kind of that kind of experience of being reminded of going to a rep theater and
Hmm.
watching something that maybe you haven't seen for the first time, or watching a programmer put together something really interesting, and yeah, it's why you go to the movies, and it just excited me in a way that I haven't had that excitement in a very long time.
Cool, man. Thank you all for listening. We have a lot of other TIFF coverage that you guys can check out right here on YouTube, on the Untitled YouTube channel, or on audio podcast services at Untitled Movie Reviews if you want to listen to us on the go or not have to see our stupid faces. You can get all of our one-stop shop for everything Untitled over on Letterboxd. Our HQ is Untitled_movies. We'll have our average ratings for everything that we watch, as well as links to our YouTube videos, our reviews in podcast form. Just everything's over there. So Untitled_movies over on Letterboxd. As always, my name is Matt Rohrbeck. You can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly at UntitledMoviePodcast.com. And you can follow me on all of the social medias at Matt Rohrbeck.
And I'm Eric Marchin. You can find more of my video reviews at rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on the social medias at em6211.
Until next time.
I feel like we should have like a little flashing subtitle at the bottom, say promoting Soderbergh's website.
Sure. Yeah, just a flashing. Bye now. Bye, everybody.